Coach Amber here, and I made a post at the beginning of last week about how powerlifting and the sport of powerlifting can feel monotonous. Now, this goes for almost every sport. The monotony of practice is required for skill acquisition, and skill acquisition is very important in all sports for performance. So, your coaches aren't programming you monotonous movements for no reason. Part of powerlifting is building the skill of the actual big three, your squat, bench, and your deadlift. And skill building comes from repetitive practice. I also coach soccer, more specifically goalkeepers, and I've gotten feedback from them about training sessions being monotonous as well. And I know that the head coach of the soccer team has also gotten feedback from the players about some practices feeling a bit monotonous or repetitive. And the reason for that being is because coaches tend to try to simplify their coaching decision making on skill development around three different topics. One is skill adaptation. Two is subtask adaptation. Is there a part of a specific skill that needs to be improved? And then there's structural adaptation. So for the two sports, soccer and powerlifting, those are going to look very different. Today I'm going to focus more on powerlifting than soccer, but I'll try to make that connection for a field sport as well. Now, one book that I read that really opened my eyes to what it requires to build a skill is The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. If that's not a book that you've read, I would suggest in your free time reading it. It definitely offers some knowledge around skill acquisition and, the monotony of training and what it takes to be great at something. So the reason that training often feels repetitive is so that we address the specific skills needed to execute the lift or to execute the performance of the sport. That is the skill itself, its parts, and the integration of those parts, and the structures that apply to those skills or the subtasks of the skill. So as I mentioned earlier, the three targeted adaptations that we're thinking about when prescribing exercise or prescribing a training plan is skill adaptation, subtask of a skill adaptation, and structural adaptation. Now I'm going to go through each of those, talk about what they mean, why and when we use them, and how we can integrate them back into our performance. So beginning with skill adaptation, what does it mean? More experiences in a given situation, so for powerlifting, more experiences of squatting is going to give the athlete more data to work off of, give their brain more data to work off of, and more practice of the skill of the sport. For soccer, that might look like passing, and these are what people quote unquote call the basics. Major in the minors, whatever cliche topic you want to talk about, but this is about practicing the basics and the skills that are required in order to build a great performance. So when we're talking about powerlifting, we're talking about bench, squat, and deadlift directly, often referred to as your main movements. Why and when do we use them? Well, for beginners, most instances of practice or experience with the lift, or for beginners, they need more instances of practice or experience with the specific lift to better their ability to execute the lift. Sometimes you just need to be exposed to those movements or to a skill more so that you can continue to build the pattern that it requires. For intermediates or advanced, it typically leans into more instances of practice within specific intensities, speaking on powerlifters specifically. So you might think that, or you might notice that while you're training for powerlifting, that you get up into the 88-90% of your 1 rep max range and your skill deteriorates a little bit. We would be focused on working on that, your skill at that specific intensity. So rather than it being a gross motor problem, whereas beginners might just need to experience more instances of squatting, you might need to experience more instances of squatting at that specific intensity where your breakdown occurs. And this is what a lot of coaches refer to as elevating the basement. Can we create, or can we have, execute at a higher intensity without breakdown? And that can be a good cue to us that we are improving, because we can't always add weight to the bar or increase intensity. But if we can, through a block of training, be able to execute at 90% of our 1 rep max the same way, or have it look the same as when we execute 75 to 85%, then we know that we've raised that floor or the basement a little bit, so that you can then continue to pursue higher intensities or a greater 1 rep max. For intermediates and advanced, the skills and ability to execute a movement change when the intensity changes. We just want to be able to build on our ability to execute at those high intensities and be able to build that basement up. Like I said, for beginners, might be a different story. So here is an example for when we might use more of a skill building or skill adaptation, or might be chasing a skill adaptation over, let's say, a subtask or a structural. Athlete 1 has been training for more than 3 years, but has only ever approached higher intensities or higher percentages during their meet preps. When they execute a bench above 90% of their estimated 1 rep max, their bench press execution is noticeably different from their previous sets. This tells us they have built the skill acquisition of the particular movement within a certain percentage range. We can provide them with more practice at those higher percentages to improve their skill of the movement at those specific and higher percentages. For powerlifters, this is important because they'll need to execute these lifts at higher percentages during a competition. Second example, athlete 2 is new to bench pressing, and each of their sets are executed noticeably differently. This tells us they may need to gain more experience with the movement through practice. More practice will likely make each of their subsequent reps look the same or similar to the previous one. We may use several tools like increased frequency of the movement to improve the number of experiences and decrease the time between those experiences to help build the skill adaptation. So athlete 1 is more of that intermediate to advanced, where we might be building the specific skill within a specific intensity. Athlete 2 is more of that beginner, where we need to just build the skill at baseline. Now, that increased frequency and decreased time between experiences allows the athlete to build the skill of the movement they're minimally practiced in. I call this the copy and paste. Each rep should look like it was pasted from the previous one to denote skill acquisition. Moving on to number 2, subtask adaptation. What does it mean? Each skill can be broken down into a series of subtasks within the movement. So when we talk about a squat, you have to descend with the bar and then use some of that elastic energy at the bottom to recoil and then ascend with the bar. So we have both the descent, we have the bottom of the squat, and we have the ascent of the squat. The tools we use to address subtask adaptation are typically referred to as your supplemental movements. These are things like good mornings, tempo squats, pause squats, tempo benches, maybe even Larson benches. This is where we use constraints upon those main movements to direct the adaptation at something very specific within that skill. Now, for soccer players, this might look like passing under pressure. You aren't always wide open to be able to take your time to make a pass on the soccer field. So then we add in defenders to your passing patterns in order to have you work on the subtask of passing while under duress. Why and when do we use subtask adaptations? We use variations to address each of these subtasks or breakdowns within a certain portion of the skill, the overarching skill, that an athlete experiences with the movement. This can be used for both beginners and intermediate to advanced lifters. It's often used when there is a chronic or repetitive breakdown in the same spot of each movement, or an athlete is chronically getting red lighted, a powerlifter is chronically getting red lighted for a technicality during a competition. Let's say they're a deadlifter and they often get red lighted for ramping. We're probably going to want to work on the subtask of the lockout on the deadlift, which might mean addressing the movement off the floor, but we're working on the subtask of the lockout on the deadlift so that they learn to lock out in a proper manner without ramping so that they can get white lights and be successful in their performance on the platform. Examples here. Athlete 1 tends to miss bench presses in the top third of the movement and uses a medium to a wide grip for their bench press. In this instance, I might implement a close grip bench press to work a more tricep dominant version of the sport specific movement. So they're still benching, it's still pretty sport specific, but the narrower grip or the closer grip will force them to use their triceps more, and the triceps are a muscle that's mostly utilized in the top portion of that bench press. So remember, they're struggling in the top third of the movement. So I'm going to implement something like a close grip bench press that's going to be more tricep dominant, but also be sports specific. And this will improve their tolerance of getting the bar to continue to move through the top third of the portion, or to help them gain the sensation of what it feels like to complete a lockout under high exertion. Another example, athlete 2 often misses their conventional deadlift right off the floor. We might implement deficit deadlifts to build quad drive and overall leg drive to improve the velocity through their sticking point so they're not starting from a dead stop right where their sticking point is. They're actually creating some velocity so that they can work through that sticking point or where they would originally start from the floor, and to increase their tolerance of a greater range of motion. Those are just two examples of two movements I would use as more of a subtask goal in mind as a coach when I'm looking to prescribe movement. So again, I'm looking at all of my programming through the lens of these three kind of goals: to build the skill, to work on a certain subtask of the skill where breakdown might occur, and now the third one is a structural adaptation. What are structural adaptations? Well, this is where we intend to create a change in the structure of the athlete in front of us that will favor improvement of their competition movements. For example, if we're working on that example 1 that I just talked about in subtask adaptation, for an athlete who might be failing at the top third of their bench press and might be lacking tricep strength, I might be looking to add tricep mass and increase cross-sectional area of the triceps will bias them or give them a better opportunity to improve their strength of their triceps and therefore allow them to bench press through that top third of the range of motion. Why and when do we use structural adaptations? Structural adaptations are brought into play when there's an obvious lagging muscle group in one of the following areas that is contributing to the inability to improve the skill or the execution of the movement: muscular cross-sectional area, the length of a muscle, the structural integrity of a joint, or the metabolic tolerance of a lagging muscle group. So an example here is athlete 1 often fails their bench press within the mid-range of the movement. Upon further investigation, you notice that the pecs and anterior delts are heavily underdeveloped as compared to the muscles of the back. This calls for improvement of pec and anterior delt cross-sectional area, which might involve building a metabolic tolerance of those muscles to be able to improve the amount of work done by them so that they can grow. If we don't have the metabolic tolerance, we won't be able to execute the amount of volume that we need in order to create structural change and for the muscle to grow. That also requires nutrition too. Structure dictates function, so it is equally important to also utilize subtask adaptations as well as skill adaptations to integrate those structural changes into the skill of the movement. Now, what does that mean? Simply, that means I can't just grow my triceps and expect for that to improve the lockout of my bench. I can't just grow my pecs and my anterior delts and expect for that to be the solution to improving my inability to press through the middle range of a bench press. I also need to use these structural adaptations and integrate them back in through subtask adaptation and then eventually into the skill adaptation. Building cross-sectional area alone will not improve your total or your numbers on the platform. It requires integration of that new tissue into the specific skill, which is again why this sport gets so monotonous. You're building muscle, you're reintegrating. You're building muscle, you're reintegrating. And a lot of times this feels like you're just stuck in the dry cycle where you're just spinning around and around and around and doing some of the same things over and over and over again. But you have to understand there are differences in your body that you're trying to achieve and use to your advantage in order to improve your total on the platform. Let's talk about another example. Athlete 2 has very large quads but lacks visual hamstring girth, leading to a large discretion between their squat and their deadlift. Now, this calls for the improvement of the cross-sectional area of the hamstrings, but once it's improved, it's important to integrate this new tissue growth into subtask adaptations, maybe something like an RDL. Can we build muscle mass? Then can we use that muscle mass and that muscle group directly in order to improve strength of the hamstrings to extend the hip? And then can we take that hip extension and utilize it through their deadlift in the actual skill that's going to be performed on meet day? So I hope that by learning these three lenses and after learning these 3 points, you can understand why movements begin to feel monotonous. While you can work on a certain structural adaptation, it's important to continue to practice the skill and to integrate those changes, as those structural changes will alter your skill moving forward. This often creates a practice plan that looks similar from week to week and block to block, as these new adaptations and integration of them take time in your skill acquisition. And sometimes that skill even changes based on the structural changes you've exhibited. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I hope this answered some of your questions and eased some of your pain around the monotony of training for powerlifting or training for sport. A lot of this feels like a dry cycle where you're going over and over again, like I mentioned earlier. And that's because it is. It's not meant to be different every single time. Skill acquisition takes a lot of repetitive practice. If you have any questions, you can find me at ambitious_strength_ on Instagram. You can shoot me an email, ambitious.strength9@gmail.com. And I'd be more than happy to continue to chat about this topic with you. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.